Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to make objects move using the translate function, and I've modeled up a little snail race here, and what I'm going to do is make a controller, and every tick of the game it's going to translate one of the snails by a certain amount. It's going to randomly pick a snail and just make it move some amount. So how do we translate an object? Well, the translate function is actually in the object's transform. So if you click on any object in your scene, you'll see that it has a transform. And a transform has a position, a rotation, and a scale. And the position, rotation, and scale objects have X, Y, and Z variables in them. So if I wanted to change an object's X, I could say, change snail 1's transforms position X. Or change snail 2's transforms scales Y, right? And that would stretch the thing. Now the transform also has functions built into it, and one of those is translate, and translate will change the position by a certain amount, and that's how we're going to get the snails to move, by using the translate function, which is in the transform object in every game object. So let's take a look at how that's going to work. I'm going to start by, well, I've got my snails in my scene already, and I'm going to create an empty object, and this is going to be my controller. And we did this in Game Maker. We created empty objects, and I'm going to set its tag to be game controller. That's just a name tag I'm slapping on it. It doesn't even matter where in the world this object is, because it's invisible and I can't see it. You can see it doesn't have a renderer or anything like that. So you could also just make a regular object and turn off its mesh renderer and its colliders and all that. That would work too. And I've got a little controller script. I'm going to put the controller script on my controller, and then let's go take a look over at Visual Studio here. So what I've got in Visual Studio is a script called controller, and it has an array of game objects, a game object array, and the array is called snails, and then I'm allocating 3 slots for 3 game objects. So I'm making an array of game objects called snails, and I'm giving it 3 slots. Why? Because there's 3 snails in the game. And then I've got this variable here called speed. This is how much we're going to make the snails move every clock tick, and we can change that around. We'll be able to we'll play with that, so the race ends up kind of being aesthetically pleasing. So notice that this array here is public, which means it's exposed in the inspector. It's visible to the outside world. And if I go back to my Unity game here, you'll see that in the controller script, if I expand this, you'll see that snails, the array, has a size of 3, and there's 3 slots here where I can drag in 3 game objects. So guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to take snail 1 and drag him there. I'm going to take the other snail. So I'm going to take my 3 snails and drag them over into those 3 slots. So every slot in that array is referencing one of the snails on the screen. So now let's go back to the code, and in our update function, let's pick a random number, 0, 1, or 2, and that'll be the slot of the snail that we're going to move. So let's I'm going to make an integer here called index, and I'm going to set it equal to random dot range. And so this is how you generate random numbers in Unity. Is a little different from Visual Studio. You don't have to make a new random number generator. There's a class called random that has a function built into it. And let's say 0 to 3, and I think, will that work? Nope. 0 to 3, there we go. So that'll give us a number between 0 and 3, but not including 3, so 0, 1, and 2. And now I'm going to tell the snail in that index to go move. So how do I do that? Well, it's an array, so I'm going to use snails square brackets to say which snail I want to move. Snails sub I. So I'm going to move a snail sub index. I'm going to move the snail in that index. So if this turned out to be 0, I'm going to move the snail in slot 0. If this turned out to be a 1, I'm going to move the snail in slot 1. How do I move it? Well, let's hit the dot operator and see what it has in it. Oh, look, it has a transform. And we know that because we can see it in the inspector. There's the transform right there. The snails, the game objects have a transform. And let's go into the transform and see what's in there. And if we hit the dot operator again, you will see that there's a translate function. So the translate function just means slide this thing. And then let's look at the different ways we can use the transform function. We can pass it a vector 3, which is a collection of 3 values in x, y, and z. We can pass it the actual numbers in x and a y and a z. And I guess that's kind of it. There's just kind of different varieties of that. So let's say we want to translate this thing. Well, okay, we could say like x, y, and so the z-axis is forward. So we could say speed. That would work. So move forward, or move 0 in the x direction, 0 in the y direction, and speed, whatever that happens to be, in the z direction. And anytime you translate something, you multiply it by this factor called time.delta time. And time.delta time is a smoothing factor that takes into account the fact that the frame rate is not constant. And what it will do is cause the motions to smooth out. So anytime you see motion, you will probably see it multiplied by time.delta time. That is one way to do this. We could say move 0 in the x, 0 in the y, speed in the forward direction, in the z, down the z-axis, times that smoothing factor. That would work. But that kind of assumes that the snails are lined up with the x, y, z-axis system of the world. So there's another parameter here. We can say space.self or space.world to say which axis system we're talking about. I don't know what it defaults to. That's a good question. I don't know what I think it defaults. Well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. But now another way to do this, and I'm going to comment out this line, is to do it this way. Vector 3 dot forward times time dot delta time. Now why is that not working? Vector 3 dot forward is obsolete. Oh man, I feel so obsolete these days. There it is. So Unity's gone through some changes over time. So just tell it to move in the forward direction and then multiply the smoothing factor times that. And then we could also multiply that times our speed. There we go. Actually, yeah. So multiply it times, it's not going to matter, but I'm just going to switch these two things. Multiply the forward direction times however fast you want to go times the smoothing factor. And that should make each snail move. Now we'll see what happens. This snail this update function is going to run once per frame, which is roughly 60 frames per second. And let's run it and see what it looks like. And if it doesn't look right, then we can go change it. Ah, it looks pretty good actually. Whee! Go Shelly! Go. And there's no code to check if anybody won or anything like that. Alright, let's try it again and just see if the random numbers work out differently. Yep, they're working out differently because remember the snail closest to us was moving much faster. There we go. So that's how we get them to move. We just use the translate function that is built into the object's transform. Now to teleport objects, that's a different technique, and I'll cover that in a different video. But there you go. If you just want to slide an object forward or in some direction, you call its transforms translate function, and then give it a vector for the direction you want to go, multiply it by the speed, multiply that by time.delta time. So something like that. That would work for you. And if you want to play with this, you can notice because these variables are public here. What if I change the speed to 1 point? What if I change it to 3? Let's run that and see what happens. Now they'll go a lot faster. All right, well, there it is. You know, there's nothing quite like a good snail race. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions on transform.translate, don't hesitate to ask.